War games are back on the table here at Diagonal Move, and for the first time in what feels like forever, I'm able to get a decent in-depth look at a Hex Encounter war game. It's probably only been 2 or 3 months, but it feels like a much longer. So I figure where better to start with this reinvigorated look at wargaming than with Salerno 43, the most recent entry in the series of games, which doesn't really have a title, but it's designed by Mark Simonitch, published by GMT Games. This is looking at the invasion of Italy in September 1943, and it's a game that, in my opinion, occupies a fairly interesting place in the difficulty scale for wargaming, because if you've ever had any experience with Hex Encounter wargames at all, you'll probably pick this one up quite quickly and would be a relatively gentle next step in your wargaming career. However, if you're completely brand new, there is still enough crunch here to make it quite a challenge to fully incorporate or assimilate everything that's going on. And so what I'm going to do here is a how to play video in which I look at the essential components of Salerno 43 and how you can fit it all together and be up and running, hopefully with a somewhat flatter than normal learning curve. Now, this is my first game in this series, so I cannot possibly comment on how it compares to any of the other games. And I've played the shorter scenario. There's 2 scenarios in the book. The Avalanche scenario, I believe it's called, which is 8 turns long, and then a 20-turn campaign. I have played 2 games of the shorter scenario, and I'm partway through an online game of the campaign. So the video here is going to be focused on what you need to know for that shorter scenario so that you can have your first go at the game. All that being said, then, I'm going to start with a look at the map. Before we dive into the detail of the map for Salerno 43, let's have a think about the map of Italy itself. So Salerno is at the southern end of Italy near the boot, and on this map I've got here, this atlas, it's actually just here with Napoli and then Rome to the sort of the northwest there. Important thing to note about Italy, and particularly due to the impact this has on the game, is that all the way up here is a great big ridge of mountains. There's a spine of mountains that runs almost the entire length of the country, from the coastline up to the Alps in the north. This impacts the game because it takes quite a mobile group of units and slows them right down and makes it a very defensive territory for the Axis side as the Allies try to push their way up. And so as we look at the game and as we learn how to move all the different units around and so on, just bear in mind that the terrain is going to have a very big impact on how some of those units can operate, on the directions in which you can move around the map. Here is how the Gulf of Salerno is represented in the game map. There's a large area of sea which you cannot enter, and that is taken up with things like the general record track, the weather track, the turn track, the sequence of play, aid memoir, and then just here, possibly slightly off shot, is a terrain key. We also have reserves and a eliminated box. Then up here is we have what's called a remnant display, which is where almost a third step in some of those counters that feature in the game would sit while the stronger forces are on the board. Off to the side there, sort of just over here, is the scenario card for both sides, and as you can see there are some units that are still on there, even though this is the end position of my most recent game of the short scenario. Essentially these units here are very much part of the campaign. They don't really come on until turn 8, which is the final turn of the shorter scenario, but where the tide really begins to turn from heavily reinforced Axis side to that more reinforced Allied side. So let's have a look at the map. The darker terrain, for example here, down the bottom here, and then scattered around is mountains, and that's really important. We will look how the effect of mountains when we come onto things like movement. just here, all this other kind of slightly less dark greeny brown colour, that's all hills, and they have quite an important impact upon things like movement and combat, particularly for things that influence combat. So for example, any modifiers for tanks and also for movement. This patch here is clear terrain. You've got the beach, the invasion beach just here. Oops, just moved that massively. The invasion beach just goes along here, and then there's another area up here. But within the game terms, this space here is basically unavailable to the Allies because that is mined. There's lots of sea mines out there, which makes it unusable. There are also things like the smaller roads, which are these like lighter blue lines. Lighter orange, lighter pale yellow lines. There's also these thicker grey lines, which are the main sort of arterial roads, or what passes for arterial roads in 1943. And the only other thing to note really is we have a blue sort of river or a network of minor rivers. The scale is relatively small, so each hex represents just 2.35 miles or 3.8 kilometers. So it's a relatively small area that we're looking at. There are a couple of other features as well. For example, we have Salerno, which is a city and a port. We can come onto those different things as we go. There's also a few other cities dotted around, and then there's a line here. Sort of probably can't see it, but there's a faint line running up here, which shows the area of operations for the 5th Army and the 8th Army on the Allied side. And in the campaign, that has an influence because all those units that are currently sat on the scenario board are part of the 8th Army, and they come on with a few separate rules towards the midpoint of the game. For the purposes of this, though, those special rules applicable to that campaign I won't really cover because that is not going to happen in the short scenario, which is where I'm aiming this tutorial at. The only other thing to note, and this is very important, is that there are these little red circles in various different places, and they are victory point hexes. And the next thing I'll talk about is how you win a game of Salerno 43. Salerno 43 is very much a game where you're playing with the historical result in mind. For the Allies, you have to take certain hexes and certain other places around the edge of the map in order to generate enough victory points to equal or exceed the historical result as it's reflected in points. For the short scenario, that is 8 points at the end of the turn, at the end of the game, end of the 8th turn, and there's a different scoring, higher scoring for the campaign. You claim those points simply by occupying the hex or being the last person to occupy the hex. There's also these edges around the edge of the map, or you might not be able to see them, but there's some edges around the edge of the map, and if you reach certain points on the edge of the map, you will also get victory points should you get enough of your units there. They're essentially reinforcement entry areas for the Germans, and I'll show you those when we do the reinforcements. But there's a few different places to score points. They're very dotted around the edge of the map, and really it's in the Allies. The Allies sort of have the emphasis on trying to take that ground and take those victory points. The Germans have to prevent that happening. Now, historically, the Allies pushed forward and eventually, after some intense fighting, did get to the top of the map and to certain places near the top, which are worth victory points, as well as taking Salerno itself, which is just there. The Germans, for the short scenario, have to sort of stop the Allies getting that certain number of points, and the terrain allows them to defend certain locations. And so as the game progresses, it can become quite clear who is likely to win by the end of a certain turn. So for example, this shorter scenario here on the board is the finishing position actually at the end of turn 7, where it's quite clear that the Allies have taken all the victory points that they need and more to win the scenario with very little the Germans can realistically do. From that mindset point of view, this is a game where, as the German player or the Axis player, you win the game by losing less badly than the historical result was for the German side. So bear that in mind when you first come into this. While you can push the Allies off the beaches and have a thorough win with a sudden death victory, and I'll come into that in a moment, most of the time you will be losing ground as you try and just win against the historical result rather than overwhelmingly defeating the Allied forces. I mentioned that there's a way to automatically win Salerno 43 without going all the way to the end of the scenario, and this is reflective of the historical pressure that both sides were under in order to achieve certain results. In the game, it's reflected by a benchmark or a points threshold against which you're measured at the end of the Allies' turn. Now, on the turn track, which is this box here, or this set of boxes here, there's a bunch of information, but the bit we're interested in for this point is the yellow stripe, which has a number written in it on some of the boxes. And if you are short of that threshold as the Allies, there's a potential chance that you will lose the game. If you are higher than the threshold as the Allies, there is a chance that you will win the game. So basically you have to be within 5 points either side as the Allies to win or lose automatically. So the Germans can force that automatic defeat, and the Allies can punch through and gain an automatic victory. Let's take a quick look at the turn structure of Salerno 43. It is an I go, you go structure where one side makes all their moves and combat various checks before the next player takes their turn. And the sequence is, first there is a weather phase. Now this happens at the start of the turn. Then you run through 5 separate phases, once for each side. So you will have the weather, then the Germans will go, and you'll have an initial phase where you place reinforcements and certain other things. You'll move, you'll have combat, you'll go through a recovery phase, a supply check phase. Then the Allies will go, and you'll run through those 5 phases again before checking for victory with that automatic victory threshold in mind. The weather is only rolled for once at the start of the turn, not at the start of each player's activation. Counter density in Salerno 43 is relatively low. There just aren't that many units on the map compared to many other hex and counter games. There is a fair number of different types of counter and a fair number of different types of units represented by those counters, and a fair amount of information on each of those counters as well. So this is where some of the crunch comes in. Some of that information is better represented in a situation where I'm showing combat or movement, and some is better represented here. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what's in the game, what some of the symbols are, and a sense of how some of these things interact. So the counters themselves, in terms of the symbols, are a mix of those more traditional NATO symbols and then symbols which are specific to the game. So for example, down on this side here, we have the infantry, we have some airborne infantry, some motorized or mechanized infantry, and then we have a symbol here for the panzers, and then a symbol for tank units. The difference in coloured counter is to do with the 2 sides. So the sort of the green colour are the Americans, the sandy colour here are the Commonwealth, which is British and other forces on the Allied side. The grey counters are the Wehrmacht or the German army, and then these blue counters here are Luftwaffe forces. There are certain rules about what units can work together, and I'll come on to those when we talk more about other aspects of the game. But just for the counters for now, there's a few different factors on these counters that represents the units, which are most of these, with the exception of these 3 here, which represent certain other things. But just sticking with the counters for now, we have in general a attack strength. In the center there is a defensive strength, and then a movement point. And the different numbers reflect the relative mobility or strength of the different units. The information to the side here represent what division they belong to. So here we have the 45th, the 509th, the 29th Panzers. There's also information on the other side, and if we just look at this first counter, we have a darker 2. That is representing its landing point value, so how many counters can fit in a reinforcement wave. Come on to that when we look more at the invasion phase that happens. There's also a very small number in the top right hand side. That is the turn of reinforcement entry, or the turn of entry. Sometimes, for example, on this counter here or this counter here, that has a small letter next to it, which for the axis side represents whether they come on the north of the map or the south of the map, and the turn in which they enter. There are some counters with additional information that alter that basic information that I've shown you. For example, these counters here are the what's known as the artillery support units, or the ASUs, that essentially create a command structure on the field for the two sides, and they can provide things like benefits in combat and so on. Two different types of those, and this is quite important when we come into combat. You have a divisional, which can support units from its division, and a core ASU, which can support any friendly units. For the Allied side, there is certain interdependencies that you can have between the Americans and the Commonwealth, and essentially you can use each other's invasion beachheads and so on, but you can't really join together in combat. That's the main thing. There are subtleties to it, but that's the main thing. This counter here is a beachhead. This is where the Allies first come onto the board in terms of an invasion, and this is the point at which they draw supply later. A very important unit with its own unique rules, which we'll probably come on to when we cover the invasion phase that happens at the very beginning of the game, but we'll do that later. This is a garrison. Some of those factors are similar, some of them are slightly different. For example, here we have a variable defensive strength, and here we have a hex number that shows where it starts the game. This counter here, which is a Fallschirmjäger airborne unit, has a red outline to its defensive strength, showing it's an elite unit, and that's important in combat. This counter is a air support counter, which can provide benefits in combat. This is the naval equivalent, a naval support counter, again can provide benefits in combat. Won't worry too much about the information on there at this point. It's applicable to which part of combat they work in. Then we have disrupted. This shows when a unit is currently suffering from the effects of combat and cannot act as it might normally do. On the reverse of that is full retreat, which is almost like the next step of disorganization along. So the unit types will go good order, then you'll have disrupted, and then finally full retreat. The other thing to bear in mind about the counters, and I found this slightly confusing when I first came to it, is that there are mechanized and non-mechanized units. So non-mechanized units are infantry. They're on foot. That's fairly straightforward. Mechanized units are these units here. They may have wheels on their symbol. They may be a tank. But broadly speaking, they have a higher movement value in each case. Here we have 5s or 6s, and the non-mechanized have 3. So it's a different mode of transportation as they move around the map. But what's confusing is that these 3 units here count as vehicles. However, these 2 units, although mechanized, do not count as vehicles. And that's quite important because it impacts movement and zone of control. So just to recap, even though this counter has wheels and this counter looks very, very similar to this counter, only the 3 on the right hand side are vehicles. The other 2 purely count as mechanized, and they're actually mechanized infantry units. The other key thing to think about here is stacking, and this works slightly differently to many other games that I've played, in that it's not a pure number of counters that represents the stacking limit. There's actually a stacking point value that you cannot cross. Different units have a different stacking value depending on their size, type of unit, and so on. The black numbers here, which reflect the landing points for the allies in terms of their reinforcement waves, also acts as the stacking value for that counter. For example, this Panzer Grenadier unit here has a stacking value of 3, reconnaissance unit stacking value of 1, the ASU for the 29th Panzers is 0. This unit here, with just the tank silhouette, does not have a stacking value printed on it, because they stack for free when there's 1. After that, these units with the silhouette and the white circle count as 1 per counter. So initially the first one is free, after that it's 1 per counter. This group of 5 has a stacking value of 4. The ASU is free, the reconnaissance has 1, these two have 1, the tank value is 3. That's a total of 3. If we were to add in an additional unit valued at 3, it would be 6, and that would be the most we could stack in. If we were to then add in some further units, they would be overstacked, and that would not be possible in the game. Stacking applies, or when you count stacking, is at the end of the movement or retreat from combat phases, where you have to count the number of points in any one hex and correct any transgressions over that limit at the end of the movement of the counter. So you can move through other units on the board, even if you are overstacked at the point in which you move through, but you cannot end on a hex with other counters over that stacking limit. Movement works in a very similar way to many other hex and counter wargames. Basically, you have a different type of terrain, so for example mountains and hills and clear and road, and they have a cost to traverse that terrain. That cost depends upon the unit type and certain other factors as well. Each unit has the movement allowance, and basically you pay to cover that terrain cost with the movement allowances. For example, this unit here is a Panzer Grenadier unit. It counts as a mechanized unit. It's sat in hilly terrain. For a mechanized unit, hilly terrain in Salerno 43 costs 2 to cross. So it would cost 2 of its 5 movement allowance to cross 2 spaces. That there would be 2 of its 5 movement allowance. That would be 4. It could not go any further. For the infantry, or in this case represented by a non-mechanized airborne unit, there's a difference between mechanized and non-mechanized infantry here, it would be 1 per hill space, and that would be 1, 2 and 3. That helps to reflect the differences in unit type on the ground and historically mobility and so things like that. Tanks are similar, they are a vehicle type. They would cost 2 per hilly terrain, like so. If units were in the clear or in the mountains, those values would be different. We'll look at mountains in a minute, but basically the clear terrain reduces the cost to traverse. Now, we are on roads, and this is the first of the types of movement you have. So you have the basic movement, which I just showed you, where it's a certain cost per hex. We then have something called road movement. Now, road movement for vehicle units or mechanized units have a slightly different cost depending on the type of road. So for example, for a minor road, which is this sort of yellowy squiggle here, the cost is reduced by half. So it would be half a point, 1 point, half a point, 1 point. So you can go much further as a mechanised unit on a minor road. If you're on one of these grey, thicker lines, with thicker squiggles, that is reduced by a further amount, and it's 1 movement point per 3 road hexes. So it would be 1, 2, and then 3. Almost off the board there. In fact, we are off the board. And so for a vehicle unit or a mechanised unit, it's far easier to move on the road than it is to move off-road, which makes sense. For the infantry, the foot-based infantry, that cost remains at 1 on the roads. However, for the German side, not the Allies, just the Germans, you can jump in a truck and take advantage of mechanised and vehicle movement on the roads using the movement point value of the truck. That reflects the better supply infrastructure of the Germans at this point versus the Allies who have just invaded. One thing to note, there's a special movement allowance for the ASUs who do count as motorised, so they can take advantage of the extra movement and get themselves all the way up here. But if they do that, if they move more than 1 hex, they become disrupted, which then prevents them from taking part in any combat. There is a type of movement known as extended movement, which means that you can add 3 movement points to your movement allowance, whatever that is, so long as you do not end your movement in a zone of control of the enemy. For example, this Fallschirmjäger unit has 3 movement points, which means you can go 1, 2, 3 using normal movement. Road movement doesn't really apply for the foot soldiers, as we saw before. It can add an additional 3, which would allow it to come here. But because we have 2 zones of control, it cannot enter those spaces. It could possibly move over here across the river should it choose to. There are movement rules for rivers, which I will come on to shortly. But in principle, so long as it doesn't enter these hexes around here, it's okay to add on those 3 additional movement points. Now, sometimes you just don't want to move very far, or you don't want to have to sit and calculate all the different terrain costs of moving just a few short spaces, and therefore this system includes something called tactical movement. And tactical movement allows you to move 2 spaces without factoring in any of those terrain costs, so long as you only move 2 spaces. And if you move into an enemy zone of control, you must stop, regardless of whether you've moved 2 or less. For example, if I just want to move to this space, I can, rather than working out all the costs of going round, I can just move this guy 1 and 2 and not worry about anything else. Tactical movement comes into its own in the mountains, which I'll come on to shortly. Rivers are their own beast. They have effects on movement, again, depending on what type of unit you are. So, for example, as I showed you a moment ago, the Fallschirmjäger unit are on foot. They can cross the river for simply an additional cost of movement points. The vehicle-based units cannot do that. They can only cross rivers where there's a bridge, and you assume that wherever a road, minor or major, cross a river, there is a bridge. So, for example, this unit here can cross there and there, no problem, but it could not do what the Fallschirmjägers just did and cross the river anywhere else. So rivers do hamper movement of vehicle type units, remembering of course that vehicle type units are only really the silhouetted tank units, the ASUs, reconnaissance, and then the occasional tank unit with a NATO symbol as well. Which brings us to the mountains. The mountains are a huge feature of this game and have a big impact on movement. Basically, you cannot cross the mountains except in one of 2 circumstances. The first circumstance is applicable to infantry type units only. So, for example, these Fallschirmjägers down here. In order to cross the mountains, you must use tactical movement and tactical movement only. In order to do that, you do the typical tactical movement, which is a maximum of 2 spaces disregarding any movement costs, so 1 and then 2. However, when you do get to the other side of that mountain, when you finish your tactical movement, you have to place on it a half effectiveness counter to show the disruption and the disorganization that you will have experienced crossing those mountains. So you can cross the mountains as an infantry unit, but you cannot use any movement other than tactical, and when you finish your tactical movement you will face a penalty in terms of how effective your units are. If you are a vehicle unit, you cannot cross the mountains at all unless you cross a pass, which you can possibly just about see here. It's a little kind of bridge symbol on the mountain hex, and you would then pay an additional cost to the normal movement terrain cost. For example, the tank unit at the very top of the screen here cannot go across to that hex using tactical movement. It has to come down and then through the pass, paying the terrain cost plus the additional cost for the mountain pass. And that really impedes movement. As you look at the map as a whole, there are a tremendous number of spaces where tanks and other vehicles cannot easily cross. I've mentioned a few times zone of control. So zone of control in general are the sphere of influence of any one unit on the terrain and the hexes around it. And in Salerno 43 it works in, basically speaking, much the same way as every other game you'll ever play in this hex encounter genre, with a few tweaks. So broadly speaking, units with a zone of control, and there are certain units that do a zone of control and some that don't. I'm not going to get into the minutiae of that at the moment. This is just a broad view on it. But broadly, a unit such as this group here, this sort of motorized infantry group, they will have a zone of control in all 6 spaces around them. So there's almost like a hexagon, like a flower shape almost around them. Equally, this reconnaissance unit will also have a zone of control around it. Zones of control can differ from between units, and this is the only real mention I'm going to mention on here on this, and that's to do with the mountains again. So for example, here we have a tank and an infantry unit. The tank cannot extend a zone of control across the mountain, but the infantry foot unit can. In terms of who is in whose zone of control in this circumstance here, the tank unit is in the zone of control of this foot infantry, but the foot infantry is not in the zone of control of the tank. Should that tank unit be at the edge of a mountain pass, it will exert a zone of control on this hex here. So in this circumstance, both those units are in each other's zone of control there. When you're in an enemy unit's zone of control, otherwise known as the enemy zone of control, or EZOC, certain things will happen, and I will come more into some of the certain effects of that later, but in principle, if you are adjacent to a unit with a zone of control ability, you will be known as in the zone of control. When you move into a zone of control, ignoring for a moment any effect that terrain might have on a normal circumstance, you would have to stop. You couldn't, for example, do that. If you start in the enemy zone of control, you can leave, providing you do not go into a second zone of control. So you can leave, but it will cost you additional movement points. So that movement here will be a total of 3, because it will be 1 for the terrain for that type of unit, plus 2 to leave the enemy zone of control. Now, if you were, as I said a moment ago, surrounded by enemy zones of control, you could not move from this zone of control into this zone of control. You're not allowed to do that. And that's important as we come into things like supply and so on as well. The unique aspect to zones of control that Salerno 43 has and other games in this series or this system has is what's known as a zone of control bond. And this essentially is where two units of the same side connect across an intervening hex to prevent enemy movement or to restrict enemy movement. There are two types. The first, if we look here at this unit and this unit, is across the hex or a hex bond. So that means that there's an invisible line drawn between these two hexes, which means an enemy cannot move through. Due to the way the map is structured, there's also another type of bond called a hex side bond, which is where the line of here, the hex, literally the hex side, also acts as a bond. So we have a hex bond directly across the center of the hex, and then the hex bond across the side of the hex. And they do the same sort of job in that they restrict the mobility of your opponent and so on. And basically you can't punch your way straight through as you might be able to in some other games and other systems. Not every unit can form these bonds. And so if you have a combat unit, generally speaking, you can form that bond, with the exception of when it has that white outline on the edge of the counter. Just pick it up there so hopefully you can see it a bit better. The little white outline on the edge of that counter, that shows that it cannot form a bond, but it does still have a regular zone of control. So in this picture here, we have hex side bond, hex bond, no bond. The bonds can be moved into, but they cannot be moved across, as I said. And in this circumstance, if you were to have a unit that moved into this side of the bond with a unit already here, you can break that bond and there is no longer a bond there. Hex bonds can cross each other. So for example, in this circumstance, we'd have a hex side bond between the two Germans and a hex bond between the two Allied forces. And one unit can have multiple bonds. So for example, if I just move this out of the way, we can have bonds here between all three of those units. So each unit has two bonds to its friendly sides. I mentioned that there are circumstances where hex side bonds cannot be formed across mountains. And again, there are nuances to that. For example, infantry or foot units can do a hex side bond across a single mountain hex. However, if we were to try and do this across two hex sides like this, that is not possible. Vehicle units can only draw hex side bonds or hex bonds across mountains where there is a road. So for example, you cannot do a bond across this mountain pass here, even though you can move through there and that sort of thing. You cannot form the bond with two vehicle units across an unroad or an unpaved mountain hex side. You have to do it across the road. So the only way you would do that here is like so, where you have a road across the hex. As with so many games, combat is the most complex part of Salerno 43. And there's a few different things to bear in mind as we go through. I won't go through tremendous detail, but just enough, I hope, to give you a sense of how the flow works and things to be aware of. So the first thing to be aware of is who can attack who. The first thing to be aware of is you can attack into a hex from multiple other hexes. So for example, down here with the British and the Germans, this hex and this hex can both attack this unit. However, that unit alone cannot attack both of those hexes simultaneously. If it was with another unit, and for now we'll just pretend it's with that unit, one unit could attack this side, the other could attack this side. Where there are multiple units involved and multiple stacks of units involved, for example up here, one of those stacks must be declared the main assault force. So it would either be, in this case, the 36th or the 45th. And that would be the key hex from which combat would happen, and the other hexes would be supporting. So for example, if we chose the 36th, this would be the main assault force and this would be the supporting force. Why is this important? Well, it's important because units of the same division can join together at full strength. Other units from the same division in the assault force hex can join at half strength. Units in other hexes join at half strength. And then support from the likes of the ASUs apply to the main assault force. And they can be specific to the force that's attacking. What does all that mean? So basically what that means in practice is if I was attacking with the 36th, I would attack with a total strength of 8 against this unit's here a defensive factor of 4. It won't be 4, I'll come into why in a moment, but you'd have 8 versus 4. Pretend for a moment. On top of that, you would have 7 halved and then rounded up, so it would be another 4. So it would be a total of 12 versus the defensive strength. Because we attacked with this hex as the main assault force, this divisional ASU, which is for the 36th, can provide a combat shift, or what's known as a combat shift, to the result when we roll the result. Should this hex here have been the main attacking force, we could not have applied the 36th Division's ASU, but we could have added in the benefit that tanks provide. This is all quite complex, and I'll go down in each one shortly. At the bottom here, another important thing to think about is this red marker. So should the Panzer unit here attack, they would have a shift for that red marker there, which is known as an elite shift. They would be able to draw support from this ASU, which is the 16th Panzer Divisional ASU, plus the core ASU here, because core ASUs can support anybody. Divisional ASUs are restricted to the division that they belong to. For the Allies combat, this Commonwealth ASU cannot support the Americans. There's that restriction in terms of operational ability there, operational cooperation. Now, I did say when calculating the strength of units, you have to factor in the terrain, and so this is not 4 because infantry units are doubled in hilly terrain. So the actual result would be 8 plus 4 would be 12 against 7. And that would work out, when you worked out the calculations, you have to work out a ratio, and the 12 against 7 would be a 2-to-1 attacking ratio in the first instance. And this is really, really important, because when you resolve combat, you look at those ratios, and then you also look at what's known as the combat results table. The combat results table is on the top here, and it's a table with die numbers down one side and ratio numbers along the top. So in that combat that we were looking at with the 36th attacking the Panzers, supported by the 45th, you would have 12 as an attacking strength versus 7 as a defensive strength due to the terrain modifier for the infantry. I know, bear with me, you would have in overall a 2-to-1 because that's how it ratios down. So 2-to-1 to the attacker. Now, the column is here, and so what you do is you roll the die, 1d6, and the result would lead to one of these results along here. And those results are listed underneath. So for example, you may lose a step in combat as the attacker if you roll really poorly. And what that means is that one of the attacking units from that main assault force would lose a side. It would go from full strength to low strength, or potentially it would move from full strength to removed. So for example, this unit here, if that had been involved, a full strength step loss would be an elimination. Some other units, much bigger units, can go from full strength, half strength, and then a remnant. And if they have a remnant, they are shown by a very thin stripe, whereas regular units are shown as having a somewhat thicker stripe. The white stripe there is the quality of the unit, and that comes into effect when you have one of the results on this table called determined defense, and I'll come to that in a moment. Other things that may happen on here is you may exchange a step loss. The defender may become disrupted, which is placing one of these counters on the unit, and then you have a combination step losses, retreats, and so on, and I'll come more onto those in a moment. But to start with, we have that basic 2-to-1 combat potential 2-to-1 column as the effect of combat. And I say potential because you can then add in the different things. So let's chuck in, as the attacker, the support from the ASU. And so you'd flip that over to its fired side, and it would move the column from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1, all of a sudden giving a much better combat potential than the original result. You can also add into that, if it's applicable and you have it available, the Air Force, which will then move it to 4-to-1. Should you also be close enough to the Navy, there is also the potential to flip the relevant Navy counter as well, which for the Allies would actually be this green one here, or for the Americans would actually be that green one. You flip that to its use side if it's within a certain distance of the beach. So basically what I'm getting at here is that that baseline calculation can be modified upwards depending on the use of support tokens. Should we have attacked with the 45th, which was this counter as the main attacking force, rather than the 36th, we would not have had this because it's not the correct support counter. We could have added in the Air Force though, and we would also potentially have had a tank benefit, and a tank benefit would again move the column one way to the good for the Americans in this example. However, because we have German tanks in there as well, they would basically count each other out. So you'd look at this smaller number, which is in the superscript there, it's a 3, and because there are 3 for both sides, no one side has a tank shift because they cancel each other out essentially. It's worth noting for those of you that may have played this game before, this system before, that there are terrain restrictions on when you can apply those tank shifts, and basically you couldn't do it in this circumstance, you couldn't do it in the hills. Basically they cancel out the tank shift ability, but in principle you can modify with a tank shift. You can also modify where relevant with the elite attacking unit there, which would also move the column. And so all these little things in terms of support and so on, they all move the column one way or the other. It's very much in favour of the attackers because the defenders, aside from a tank shift if they have it, air support and rain, which is obviously part of the weather phase, you don't really have much in terms of the defender to shift those columns around in the same way that you do the attacker. If you are brand new to Hex and Counter Wargames, that probably sounded horrendous. However, it's a lot more straightforward than you think. Basically, you add up all the units that are attacking, depending whether they're main attacking force or supporting attack. Compare that to the defensive strength of the defenders, both of which may be modified by certain factors, such as whether their effectiveness is reduced, whether they're disrupted, terrain factors. Compare the totals and then work out how close they are together. You may have double the amount of attackers versus the defenders, which would be a 2-to-1, 3 times, 4 times, and so on. And then once you've worked out where you start on this columns, you adjust the columns based on the factors that may move the column one way or the other. And then after you have worked out the difference in strength, the modifiers to the table, you roll a die and apply the result. So if we were at a 2-to-1, we rolled a 3, we'd have a disrupted result. Where some of the nuance and complexity comes in Salerno 43 is in what happens with the advance after combat and breakthrough combat results. There are a range of different outcomes from the die roll on that combat results table. Some of them, such as turning the counter over to show its reduced side, adding a disrupted counter, they're pretty straightforward. Others, determined defense, advance after combat, breakthrough combat, they're slightly more complex, and we'll just look at those in a bit more detail. Let's pretend for a moment that this unit has been attacked by these units here, with this one as the main attack force. And what's happened is they've resulted in a DR2, which means the defender would retreat 2 hexes and then become disrupted. Should you choose to, on some results from the combat result table, you can try to prevent that retreat. And this is called a determined defense. Basically, it's a die roll that can be modified in several ways, and then you either have a result that allows you to stay put, or a result that forces you to retreat, potentially at a worse cost than before. So it's a risk. But basically the way it works is, first thing you do is you select a lead unit in the defending stack. So here we only have one, so that would be the lead unit by default. If you had multiples, you would have to choose which one. Now this is important because there's a modifier based on the quality of the troops. So for example, red is an elite unit, gives you a +1 modifier. A white background is a poor quality unit, which would actually be a negative modifier. Anything without a background wouldn't have a modifier at all. But for now, for simplicity, we'll just keep the 1 unit. Other potential shifts or potential modifiers to the determined defense roll include things like the CRT, if it is either red or orange. It also includes things such as defensive support, which is where, as the defender, you can flip over an ASU in order to modify the result again. So here we could flip over one of these units, and that would reduce the modifier. Once you've worked out the modifiers, you roll a die, and you can then hold, which means you stay where you are. There's no effect, which means the defense has failed, and you retreat, applying the original result. Or you can have a delay, or you can have further step losses, and the step losses have to come to the lead unit. If you manage to roll a delay, you have to retreat, but you choose how far you retreat, and that's between 1 and 3. So rather than moving all the way back to here, you could move here. And the attacker can then only advance into the vacated hex, or 1 advance. Because normally, if you were to retreat all the way back here, or even further, depending on some results, the attacker then can move potentially a much further distance. In the event that there is nowhere for the defender to retreat to, for example up in this corner here, they're surrounded by the sea, you can conduct what is called a desperate defense, which works exactly the same way as a determined defense, except each time you roll it costs you a step in combat, as an attrition for holding on against all the odds. When you retreat, you will retreat the number of hexes stated in the combat result. That is regardless of terrain, so you do not calculate terrain cost when moving back, you simply move the number of hexes. Now, depending on what that terrain is, depends on what happens. So, for example, there are certain hexes you cannot cross, for example, the sea, and then you will be eliminated. There are hexes that prevent movement. So, for example, if we have a hex bond, so let's pretend for just a moment we have a hex bond like this, you cannot retreat because you cannot cross any of those hex bonds when you retreat. And if you cannot retreat, that is typically an additional penalty. It could be you have to do a desperate defense. It could be that you are eliminated, depending on the circumstance. Terrain and unit type will also impact. If you are, for example, a vehicle and you're forced to retreat across an unbridged river, then an unbridged river will cause an elimination of that vehicle unit. Mountain hex sites, if you have to cross one of those as a retreat in a vehicle unit, you are also eliminated. And any other unit that retreats across a mountain hex site, for example from here to here, would then have a reduced effectiveness marker placed on them, in addition to any disruption or so on that the combat result table may require. When you retreat, for example like this, you often have to become disrupted. Now, disruption is a result of the negative effect of being forced to retreat from that combat, and it results in a number of penalties. For example, you can only use tactical movement. You cannot form a zone of control bond, although you do still have a zone of control. You cannot attack, and your defensive strength is halved. You also cannot receive replacements, and if you are an ASU, you cannot be flipped back to your normal side. Should you have what's known as a full retreat result, you flip the disruption counter over and it shows full retreat, and this is more limiting again, similar to a disruption but with a worse penalty. And effectively what you can think of is full retreat being the worst position a unit could be in, followed by disrupted, and then unaffected by any penalties. As the attacker, if you force a retreat on the opponent, you can generally do what's called advance after combat. This would be stated in the combat result table, and the amount of hexes you can move would also be stated in that table. So let's pretend for a moment that that unit there was forced to retreat 2 hexes and become disrupted. That means the main attacking force for this group would be able to now advance after combat. The distance you can move would be stated in the combat result table, as I mentioned, but you do not have to advance the same route as the retreating defender. So you do not have to go like that. You could go in a different direction should you wish to, so long as you don't exceed the number of hexes stated in the combat result table. Any zones of control, zone of control bonds and terrain will impact that movement in a very similar way in which they do normally. You must stop when you go into a zone of control. You cannot go across a zone of control bond. Terrain will also influence that movement, with by far the most restrictive movement once again being movement into and around the mountains. If you finish your advance after combat, so let's pretend we've gone here, you can then perform what's called breakthrough combat. You first have to select a group of units that will perform the breakthrough. Here we only have one, so we're just going to say this is our breakthrough group of units that are going to perform breakthrough combat. You more or less follow the same combat procedure as normal, with a few exceptions. In any one combat, only one stack of units can perform a breakthrough combat. So if you had multiple that were able to move, or you split up into multiple stacks, you would only have one of those stacks that could perform breakthrough combat and advance after combat. Breakthrough combat units, or the breakthrough combat group, have basically a couple of actions they can now take. Each one has a cost. So if you have the breakthrough group and it can have 2 hex advance, one of those actions would be to advance a hex. Moving into the hex that the defender vacated, which is this one, would cost you nothing, but then moving further on would cost you one of those actions. If you choose not to move into the hex the defender left, for example, you rather than going here, you go here, that reduces your actions by 1. You can then, if you are adjacent to enemy units, conduct the breakthrough combat, which works as before, except you may not use some of those column shifts that you had previously. So you cannot use ASUs, air and naval units. And if you successfully force another retreat, you do not then advance after combat and perform another breakthrough combat. You cannot chain positive results. There is a status called Auto DS, and what this means is you have enough combat strength to force a 10-to-1 or greater result on that combat results table, in which case it's assumed the unit you're attacking automatically has the worst result possible, which is shattered, which is an extreme result of retreating and then followed by advance after combat. Worth pointing here that the maximum number of factors you can include is 20 after any rounding down, and so on has been done. At the end of the combat phase, when you have finished all the combats you want to do, you then perform the recovery phase. And what this means is that any markers that indicate a disrupted status, an reduced effectiveness status, or any truck markers are removed from those units. Units that are adjacent to an enemy, so within their zone of control, you have to roll a die and pass a test to see if this counter is removed. So you have the potential for some of your disrupted units to remain disrupted at the end of your turn. There are also ASUs that can be returned to their full strength side if you spend a supply point on them. If you do not have supply points, you cannot flip the counters. Following combat, you perform a supply phase. So at the end of all your combats, when everything's been done, you then check the supply status of all your units. Some units may be in supply, some may not be in supply. When you are not in supply, the certain negative effects happen. If your supply status is so bad that you are what's known as isolated, there's the potential for some isolation attrition to occur as well. The supply itself is drawn along a route from your unit to what's known as its supply source. For the Germans, this is a friendly map edge. For the Commonwealth and Americans, it is one of the beachhead units here, for example this one here. These are the landing zones of the invasion. Now for this example, I've put the beachhead here so that it's on the screen. It would not be here in the real game. But this unit here can draw supply overland 1-2 spaces and then carry its on-road supply line to the beachhead without any problems. There are 2 portions to that supply route. There is the overland route, which does not have a road, and then there is the road portion. The overland route can go through one, but not more than one enemy zone of control. So we could go this way if we wanted to, but probably doesn't make a lot of sense. However, more sensibly, you would draw your supply line like that. The road portion of that can be of any length, so it's only a couple of spaces and then any length. The overland portion can be no more than 5. So if for some reason we were unable to use this road and we had to do a really circuitous route to get to a road, potentially a supply could be broken by the overland portion being more than 5 away from a road. If you have enemy zones of control, the road portion breaks. So for example, if this tank unit here was there, you would have no route through in any of those spaces. There is a slightly different way that overland and road portions of a supply line deal with zones of control. Overland portions of a supply line can draw a line of supply through a zone of control. So for example, if we were here, we could draw one overland supply into the zone of control and then go to the road and follow the road. However, road portions of supply lines cannot do that. They cannot go into enemy zones of control at all. The road portion also cannot start in an enemy zone of control. So for example, you cannot start the road portion here, you'd have to go up and across. If you had a friendly unit, you can ignore the zone of control for this purpose. Now, if we had a slightly changed picture and had that enemy unit there, you now no longer can draw a line of supply for this beachhead to this unit at all. So therefore you would mark it with a out of supply marker. If you are out of supply, that will have certain impacts on combat, advance after combat, resupply and so on. However, because we cannot draw a line of supply at all, we are actually what's known as isolated. So this is like an even worse isolation, and potentially when you come to the end of your turn, if you cannot draw any supply at all, you have to conduct isolation attrition, which is where you roll a die, and depending on the result you may lose a step. This is your unit really running out of food, running out of ammo, and really being cut off. What I've covered in this video so far is the bulk of each player's turn. However, before you start your turn, there's what's known as an initial phase, which comes after a weather phase. I'm sort of doing this a bit back to front. Each player during their initial phase, which happens before movement, so with sort of this orange box here, will refer to the turn track to see whether they have any replacements, and to the scenario cards to see whether they have any reinforcements. Now, for reinforcements, that is dictated by what's on that scenario card. So some turns you may not have any, other turns you may have quite a few. For the allies, reinforcements first go into this floating reserve, then they are considered at sea, and then they can move onto the beachheads, depending whether or not they are Americans or the allies. They can also go into ports. So for example, if you have control of the port of Agropoli just there, you could also move onto the port. The beachheads have a landing value or landing restriction based upon the black number there, so you can have a total of 6 landing points at any one time coming onto each of these beachheads. Ports themselves have a number printed here, which will dictate how much of a capacity they have to take on new forces once you have control of them. And so you could have potentially quite a lot of forces, but you're restricted by the capacity of your beachheads and your ports. For the German side, and if I just zoom the camera up a little bit, see that slight muddle of counters at the top there, but you have these areas at the top, and there's another one just this side, and then some more down the bottom. That is where the reinforcements come on, and that is specified by the counters as they enter into the game. Replacements are slightly different. These are indicated by the turn track. You have a little symbol on each of the turn tracks showing whether a unit can be rebuilt in terms of flipped from its reduced side to its full strength side, or whether it can come back from the eliminated box just there onto a unit in play. Reinforcements start on the edges and on the beachheads. Replacements can start with an ASU that's in play. That's the big difference really. And of course you are limited to just the numbers shown on the screen and to what you have available. There are some restrictions also in terms of things like zones of control and enemy proximity to the counters that are being rebuilt. So there's nuances there as well. The other thing that can happen in the initial phase is you can flip ASUs. Now I mentioned this before, and for the purposes of that previous demonstration, all we really need to know is that they can remove the fired status and flip over to the non-fired status or the full strength status. To do that requires supply points. Now that is something that's determined during the weather phase, which happens at the start of every turn. So again, we're going slightly back to front. Basically, you roll a die and apply the movement on the weather track that the die indicates, and that's marked here. So a roll of 1 means there's no movement. 2 to 4 is 1 movement towards the right. 5 to 6 is 2 spaces towards the right. And so basically what you do is you move the counter accordingly, and when you get to the end you come back. Depending on which column you're in, you may have a supply point. The Allies and the Germans typically get more than the Allies because they are on the mainland rather than an invasion, and it also determines whether air units are available. So for the Allies, air units are available in 2 locations, and these 2 locations. However, the Germans are only available to draw their air support when we're in this column here. And then there are also restrictions on that based on how close the Allies are to the airfields. The final space on the weather track is the rain, which contributes a combat shift to one side and also impacts upon the ability of vehicle units to cross rivers. The invasion phase is a special activation of the Allies at the start of the very first turn that happens instead of the weather phase. And what would happen is these groups of units that are at sea currently land onto the beaches and onto the ports, and they can use tactical movement to gain a foothold on those beaches. Now, to do this, you roll the die against the invasion CRT, which is this special table here. And then once you roll the die, you perform the advance after combat, as it says there, without any other modifiers. So for example, if the Rangers were to roll a 3, they would be able to land onto this beach, making tactical movement of 2. You would mark them as reduced effectiveness because of the initial landing. The commandos may also be able to move into Salerno itself, and then these guys down here with the beach modifiers may face a bit of resistance. So if you're to land on Roger Beach, you may have a step loss, which removes potentially a counter from the game already. Now it's worth noting here, I have not set any Germans up on this board just for ease of demonstration, and you basically keep going, and some of the units may actually land onto the beaches and have a result that allows them to advance further. A beachhead must stop in the location that you are indicated by the arrow. So for example, something like that would be the final result of the invasion, and potentially you have some VPs already if you have been lucky with those dice. From here it would be the Germans' first turn, and they would have a normal turn with the exception of a reduced amount of movement. Okay, the Allied invasion of Italy has begun with the beach landings at Salerno. I think this is a good point to stop this video. I hope it has helped. I appreciate I have not covered all the nuances of all the rules. However, hopefully it will help you flatten that learning curve the first few times you play the game. What I'm going to do now is reset the game up and begin a playthrough series of Salerno 43 in my next few videos. I hope to join you then. In the meantime, happy gaming.